Like and subscribe right now, or this spider is gonna crawl on your face while you're sleeping.
Amazing survival stories that actually happened. If you're a fan of outlandish survival-themed movies and novels, then you already know how much entertaining these fictitious adventures can be. The rugged wilderness settings and crazy plot twists can captivate our attention for hours, even though there's something gnawing at the edge of our thoughts the whole time. This disbelief, and arises from the fact that deep down, we know that it's a made-up story. No matter how much our disbelief is suspended by a great storyline, we know that the tale never actually happened, and probably never would have happened. But these fanciful tales aren't the only stories that authors and screenwriters can tell. There's another kind of story that, if told well, can keep us at the edge of our seat and leave us marveling at the tenacity of the human spirit. These are the true-life survival stories, told by the people who actually lived them, and are packed with real hard-earned wisdom. Here are 8 of those amazing survival stories that actually happened. Let's go. Number 8. Sergeant James Landon. Camp Sumter, commonly known as Andersonville, was a military prison operated by the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. Even by the low standards of prisons at the time, Andersonville was notoriously horrible. The prison was overcrowded, and prisoners were forced to sleep in the open in disgusting unsanitary conditions. During the Civil War, 13,000 prisoners died in Andersonville. Following the war, Captain Harry Wurz, the camp's commander, was tried and hanged for war crimes. Sergeant James Landon, a Union soldier from Iowa, was one of the unlucky ones to have ended up in Andersonville. During a skirmish, Landon was shot in the thigh. He pried the bullet out using his knife and ran on foot from Confederate forces for 5 days before being captured. He was then forced to march for another 4 days to Andersonville. As a wounded soldier entering Andersonville's unsanitary condition, Landon didn't stand much of a chance. Amazingly, Landon survived. He was held for 6 weeks at Andersonville before being transferred to another prison camp. He was released from there after 2 months, as the Confederacy was crumbling and could no longer afford to hold prisoners. Even more amazingly, Landon didn't receive a proper medical treatment until he arrived back in the North. He lived until the age of 83 and was reportedly healthy and athletic throughout his life.
Before we move on, I've got a little challenge for you that will take just 5 seconds to complete. So here's the deal. You just leave a like on this video, smash that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell and you get 25 years of amazing luck. Try it. It really works.
Number 7. Judah Paddock and the crew of the Oswego. When British and American soldiers were shipwrecked off the Barbary coast, their best chance of survival was to make it to Morocco, which was friendly to both governments. However, if they were captured by any of the nomadic Arab tribes from the Sahara Desert, survival would be much more difficult. Judah Paddock was captain of the Oswego, a merchant ship that ran aground in 1800. The crew was forced to abandon ship and sat out on land. But when a schism developed among the crew, Paddock set out on his own with just 3 other crew members, one of whom was a useless drunkard. The survivors were captured by Arabs, who turned them into slaves. The new slaves were treated badly. They were flogged, starved, and forced to sleep outside on a regular basis. As slaves, they were most valuable as commodities and were often traded or sold from one tribe to another. Paddock believed that this was the only reason they weren't killed on the spot, although this didn't save some of the Oswego's other survivors, who ended up murdered. Paddock came to be owned by a man named Ahmed, who Paddock convinced to take him to Morocco to be ransomed. But even that required a difficult journey, as well as careful negotiation, and Paddock was not able to save his entire crew. Number 6. Victoria Grover. Things looked bad for Victoria Grover when she was stranded in the high desert of Utah. It was April 2012 and the 59-year-old had been out hiking, intended to walk around 10 kilometers. Things turned very bad very quickly when she broke her leg jumping down a small ledge. She couldn't walk and instead had to shuffle around from a seated position. Grover had no food, a problem made worse by her type 2 diabetes. Nighttime temperatures at that time of year can plunge below freezing. She hadn't told anyone that she was going. She was stuck in the Box Death Hollow Wilderness, which isn't a name to inspire confidence. Luckily, Grover had been on a survival course in the area. In 1972, something had stuck from that 40-year education, though. Grover used her walking stick and a scarf to brace her leg. She slept during the daytime and stayed awake all night, huddled under a poncho to break the wind. For the first 2 days, she was able to gather firewood, but her broken leg became too painful and she had to do without it on her 3rd night. She was found on her 4th day suffering from hypothermia. Grover came away with not just her survival story, but also claim to fame. She was flown to the hospital by the same pilot that had rescued Aaron Ralston, the climber from the movie 127 Hours. Number 5. Ed Rosenthal. Ed Rosenthal has the distinction of being the only person on this list to have written a book of poetry inspired by his time stranded in the desert. His story began with what was supposed to be a short hike, a trail of 6.5 kilometers he'd done plenty of times before. Yet he neglected to bring much water, and then he simply got carried away. He took a turn into one canyon, then off into another, miles away from his original course. "I don't know why I did it," he said at a press conference afterwards. Rosenthal ended up in a place he didn't know, with nothing to drink. He tried his own urine but couldn't stand it. He sucked moisture from a plant but found it too tiring. After a few days, he gave up and began writing a will on his hat. He wrote messages to his family, described the type of funeral he would like, and even began a poem. He then turned to God, praying for rain, and he got it. His Jewish faith was reignited with a passion. Quote, "My conclusion is that God is real. Really." End quote. He tried signaling with his foil blanket and lit fires at night with flares. No one came. On the 6th day, he was slumped in a canyon, not expecting to last another day. Luckily, he was spotted by a rescue helicopter. "I've never been so happy to see anybody," he said afterward. A couple of days in the hospital brought him back to health, and also a decision to give up hiking. Number 4. The Overland Relief Expedition. In the winter of 1897, a fleet of 8 whaling vessels, along with 265 crew members, was trapped by ice in the Arctic Ocean. Because of thick ice, it would be 6 months before rescue vessels could reach the trapped ships, and the crews stood no chance of survival without food and supplies. The dangers of the Arctic were well known, and the situation seemed dire. Just 2 decades earlier, 13 vessels had been lost in the same area. Sensing the urgency of the situation, President McKinley ordered the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Bear, under the command of Captain Francis Tuttle, to deliver supplies to the trapped whalers. The Bear sailed as far north as ice would allow and landed 3 crew members on the coast of Alaska. Using dog sleds, the 3 traveled over 2,400 kilometers across the frozen tundra, where temperatures sometimes dropped below -51 degrees Celsius. The entire journey took about 3 months. When they finally reached the ships, they were able to deliver critical supplies to the whalers, many of whom were suffering from scurvy. The Bear itself was not able to reach the area until July, when the ice had broken up enough to allow passage. Until they did, Captain Tuttle had no idea if the overland journey had been successful. It had, and the Bear was able to bring the whalers back home, the majority of them having survived. Number 3. The Tragedy at Kufra. Noel St. Malo Jewell, a World War II fighter mechanic with the South African Air Force, was part of a group that did almost everything they shouldn't have. He survived out of luck more than anything else. Jewell was part of a crew of 12 airmen spread across 3 aircrafts on a routine patrol from their station in Kufra in the Libyan desert. After spending several hours on their pre-planned route and getting back to base, they decided to continue flying as they still had some fuel left. Their first mistake was to take no notice of the directions in which they were headed, and eventually they had to make a forced landing when one aircraft was running low on fuel. After spending a night sleeping under the stars, the crew sent one plane out to fly 30 minutes in a number of directions. They expected to find their base or be rescued fairly quickly, so drank 75 liters, that's 20 gallons, of water between them on their first day. Their airborne scout didn't have any luck finding local landmarks and they ran out of petrol completely. By the 3rd day, they used all of the water and became desperate for liquid. They broke open their compasses and consumed the alcohol inside, a bad move since it was methanol and highly toxic. To gain some relief from the heat, the men decided to spray themselves with their aircraft's fire extinguishers. They got relief for a few seconds, then developed extremely painful open wounds across their skin from the blast. The next day, people started dying. The first man to go shot himself because he couldn't stand the pain in his stomach caused by the alcohol he consumed. Another 5 people had died by the next morning, and they continued to succumb to dehydration and the side effects of their injuries one by one. A rescue aircraft finally spotted the downed planes after 8 days. Jewell was the only person left alive, though barely. After the incident, the Air Force made sweeping changes to its rules for desert flight, including a requirement to include survival instructions in the aircraft. The graves of the dead airmen, the wreckage of one aircraft, and even some of their rations are still in the desert today. A nephew of one of the men found the items in 2001, but the Libyan government declared them to be antiquities that should be left in place. Number 2. Alexander Scott. One of the most dangerous sailing routes of the 19th century took ships between the Canary Islands and the western coast of Africa. Challenges along this route included strong currents blowing towards shore, sandy air, and shallow water. Shipwrecks were common. Alexander Scott was a 16-year-old sailor from Liverpool, England, whose ship, the Montezuma, was wrecked off the Sahara coast in 1810. According to his own narrative, Scott was captured by an Arab tribe, which took him as a slave. They forced him to travel with them to a place called Hez el Hez. The arduous journey across the Sahara took over 2 months, during which Scott encountered very little in the way of civilization. When they arrived at Hez el Hez, Scott was told that he must convert to Islam or be killed. Scott said that he refused to convert, although he didn't say how he managed to escape being killed. Although he remained alive, Scott was anything but free. He remained a slave for 6 years, wandering with various Arab tribes between present-day Niger and Mali in conditions that were often difficult and dangerous. Eventually, Scott managed to escape and contact the British consulate in Morocco. Number 1. Jack Renton. Jack Renton was a Scottish sailor who had the misfortune of being shanghaied while in San Francisco in 1868. After escaping in a small boat and spending 40 days at sea, Renton washed up in one of the Solomon Islands. He was captured by a native tribe, the Malaysians, who were notorious among sailors as headhunters. However, Renton managed to amaze his captors with his survival and language skills. They adopted him into the tribe, and the chief even started referring to him as a favorite son. Renton also distinguished himself as a warrior, taking part in headhunting expeditions and skirmishes with other tribes. After 8 years, Renton decided he'd had enough and found a ship to take him to Australia, where his tales from the Solomon Islands made him an instant celebrity. He occasionally returned to the islands on humanitarian expeditions. It was on one of these return trips that he was captured and decapitated by one of the Malaysian rival tribes. Renton's story lives on, however, in Malaysian oral traditions.